when I was 19, I took a trip to the US, and I took a Greyhound bus across the US. And I had a lot of spare time because I was just sitting on this bus. And one of the books I read was The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker, who's a sort of management guru for any of you who don't know. And one of the key lessons in that book is like, know your business. If you're in business, you need to know what business you're in. So if you think you're in the oil business, if you're an oil company, you're probably wrong. You're in the energy business. And if you're in the mail postal business, what kind of business you're in? You're really in communications, and you're going to be out of business unless you understand email. So let me ask you a question. What business are we all in here? So I didn't hear the comments, but so you might say, well, we're in the journals business. Or if you were sort of trying to think ahead, trying to catch me out, you might say we're in the content business. But I'm going to tell you that journals are not in the content business. So what business are journals in? If they're not in the content business, what business are we in? Information, yeah, but I would say assertions. Journals are in the assertions business. What do I mean by assertions? Here are some of the assertions that journals make. That this content is worth reading. Here are some of the others. Who are the authors? Who are the institutions? The content's been through peer review. The statistics support the conclusions, etc. So if you think about the work that a journal does, it's really collecting a group of assertions about the content, and it's the assertions which are extremely valuable. And historically, the assertions have been implied by journal format. So we didn't need to explicitly say this is the title, or this is the abstract, or this is the author. It was kind of baked into the format that a journal uses. And it was a good way of communicating assertions. And we've been doing that for 350 years, since Henry Oldenburg started in 1665. It's basically the same format, the same idea. Let's make some assertions and use format to communicate those assertions. But the assertion business is changing, and it's changing fast. First of all, it's increasingly easy to not read my text. It's increasingly easy to make false or inaccurate assertions today. If format is all you're using to communicate your assertions, anyone else can replicate that format. And what's more is, if you happen to make a bad assertion nowadays, there's a whole industry of people, like Retraction Watch, who are going to jump on you and say, well, that wasn't really an author, that wasn't really a reviewer, or you didn't cite this correctly, or the data were not supporting the conclusions. We're going to be outed very quickly. So format is no longer a guarantee of the assertion quality. And the funders that we've been talking about a lot today, who spend $1.6 trillion a year, $50,000 a second, they want to know more about those assertions. They want higher quality, more reliable, more accurate, granular assertions. And what's more, those assertions need to be machine readable, not just human readable. Because, again, we can improve the return on research investment if the assertions are more reliable. So from a journal point of view, is this an opportunity or a threat? So let's not think about content workflow for a second. Let's think about workflow in terms of an assertion workflow. So an author makes a number of assertions about what they send to you. I'm the author, these are my co-authors, here's who funded the paper, etc. one of the things that you do as a journal is that you evaluate those assertions for accuracy. And then you make your own assertions. This has been through peer review, this has good quality. And then you, as it were, boil those assertions down into the published content. But creating assertions is not the same as creating format. And there's a lot of talk nowadays of, okay, peer review, let's put the document in the middle, and everything's going to revolve around the document. Well, I would argue that everything should revolve around assertions, not the document. So we need to retool for the assertions workflow rather than the content workflow. And here I'm going to step out and have a semi-technical interlude. And for those of you who are technical, I apologize if you already know all of this. But for some people, this is probably going to be useful. So there's a word on the screen here, and it's brown, the word brown. So who can tell me what that is? Is that a university? Is it a name? Is it a color? Is it a street address? Okay, none of us really know. That's just a word. So we can put some tagging represented by those little angle brackets around this word. And this tagging is HTML tagging, so that when a software application looks at the word brown, in this case, it knows to put that word into bold. And again, that's HTML tagging. So the HTML tagging doesn't help you with assertions. All it helps you do is create format, which is not a reliable way of communicating assertions. So we have a better way of doing that, called semantic tagging. So if I put these tags around the word, you probably all know now what brown is. Brown is an author. And that's the semantic tagging. But here's the problem. One group of people might use author, another might use contributor, another might use article author, and so on. So there's a wide range of semantic tagging that might be used. So we need an agreed way of tagging the author, because right now we don't know how to do that. So that's why we have schema or DTDs, document type definitions. And that's where JATS comes in, that you've heard about. The Journal Article Tag Suite is just a way of all agreeing how we're going to tag this particular data element as an author. So we now know that Brown, and our software more importantly, knows that Brown is an author. So it's really a two-step process. The software looks at the tags, knows that Brown is an author. We then have something like a style sheet or some other similar technology that says anything that's tagged as an author should be represented in bold. And so now we know to present the word author in bold text positioned in a certain place in a certain part of our manuscript. So if software could talk, it would say, well, I'm going to look at this piece of text. I'm going to see if there's a tag. Oh, great, there's a tag. I'm going to look at the schema and say, well, what does that tag mean? Oh, good, I know it's an author. I'm going to look at my style sheet, and I know I should tag the author in a particular way, bold him, and then I'm going to go on and do the next thing. End of semi-technical interlude. So is XML just a fancy way to do formatting? You know, are we driving around in a Porsche in first gear? Because that's how most people see XML. It's kind of a fancy and convenient way to do manuscript formatting, because if you change the tag or you want to change the formatting, you can, because you just say, in future, I want authors to be shown in blue, and I just change my rule set, and now all authors are now shown in blue. But that doesn't seem to be everything that's needed to really create the assertions that we need. So how do we know which brown is brown? And you know, the obvious answer is to use a persistent identifier, in this case, an ORCID, to know which brown we're talking about, and to use an API to validate that it's not just anyone asserting that it's a particular authority source that's doing that. So if we look at the workflow, we could take the manuscript at the end and say, well, I'm a sophisticated publisher, I'm going to do XML, so I'm going to put ORCIDs into XML. But that's not done any assertions. All that's done is stick a bit of text into the XML saying this is the ORCID, and that's not really adding value. It's adding some value, but it's not really adding a lot of value, because that ORCID is not really being checked anywhere. So that's not the right place to do it. Maybe the ORCID is added by someone in the journal office, but that suffers from, it's a higher level of assertion because someone in the journal office is doing that, but it's also not really being validated. And I put a smaller red X there because sometimes this is necessary. Okay, so if the author is dead, they can't validate their own ORCID anymore. So you have to have someone do it for them. But of course, the right place to do this is through an API call to the ORCID system, where the user themselves can validate that they own that ORCID, and then that can be a reliable assertion that flows through the workflow. And the good news is, once you have one valuable assertion, you can add others. So identifying an institution to whom that author is associated, or with which that author is associated, can now be achieved if, for example, the author has logged into the ORCID system through their institutional system, which can now assert that this author Brown belongs to the university, the Northeastern University in China. So identifiers and taxonomies, and I apologize for banging on about this, are essential for improving assertions. So who did the research? ORCID. You know, if you're a funder spending $1.6 trillion a year, it's nice to know who did the research, but you probably want to know what they did as well. So that's where credit comes in. Who do they work for? That's where Ringgold comes in, or similar institutional identifiers. Who funded the research? FundRef, or Open Funder Registry, as it's now called. What did they cite? DOI. So you can probably apply this logic to many parts of what you do and see that it connects back to an assertion, a valuable assertion. And in EM and in your workflows, you're using other tools to improve assertions. So has the content been plagiarized? Well, you're using Authenticate to make an assertion that no, it hasn't. Is the content novel? Well, maybe we can use similarity check or other tools in EM to validate that. Or maybe even something like Meta that we heard about yesterday to do that in a more sophisticated, well, not necessarily more sophisticated, but a more industrial manner. Are the citations accurate? That's why we have reference checking built into Editorial Manager, and why I would encourage many of you to switch it on. Has this content been through peer review? I'd like to assert that with some level of reliability and be able to show the world that, yes, this content has been through peer review. So the PRE system from AAAS lets you do that in a formal way. This content will have impact. Again, that's where something like Meta can come in. Have conflicts of interest been disclosed? You can, again, make that assertion if you've pulled that information from a service like Convey. So now that you have good assertions, there's so much you can do. You can make content talk. So if you get a reviewer from somewhere else and you want to acknowledge that reviewer's activity, you can assert who that reviewer is. Or another use case, which is already live with some of you, is processing APCs. We can use the assertions about who the author is, which institution they belong to pass that information to another piece of software software, in this case RightsLink, to predict, not to predict, but to display to the author appropriate pricing information for their, or other business rules for their institution. So once you've got assertions, that content is extremely valuable. So in summary, assertions are a way for journals to create value in a world where content wants to be free. And let's face it, the open access movement is winning, and it's not going to go away, and the tide is coming in. And we have to think of ways of maintaining what we do as businesses that is not based on selling content, but is based on selling something else. Now, I'm not saying I have all of the answers, but I'm giving you a model here to think about what you do, which is different to the model of I'm just creating content. Because we're told by the marketplace that content wants to be free and is free. So that's, you know, do you want to fight a battle that is already lost, or do you want to move the playing field to another area where you can win the battle? And I think journals can win the battle if we change the frame of reference from the creation of content to the creation of assertions. So creating assertions is not the same as creating format. So there's a lot of talk right now about saying, oh, the document, everything needs to revolve around the document. But the assertions often exist outside the document or tangential to it. So that's why you need an assertion-based workflow, not necessarily a content-based workflow. And I've put this in twice, because it's so easy to fall back into the notion that we're creating content. So you should be looking and thinking of EM as an assertion management system, not just a content management system. Of course, EM and Production Manager are content management systems, but they're designed and will continue to grow to help you manage assertions. And the inclusion of persistent identifiers and taxonomies is a key stepping stone in that. And for your marketing departments, let's see if we can get them to think about assertions as what they're marketing, not having the best content. Because having the best content, we're being told by the marketplace, is not something that people are willing to pay for. So I realize what I said was a little, extreme, and it's meant to be just to get us thinking. But I hope that this presentation gave you a context for interpreting a lot of the things that we're doing at Aries and presented to you over the last couple of days. So I'd like to thank you for all attending and wishing you all a safe travels and an enjoyable weekend. Thank you for coming.